So, hello everybody. My name is Thomas Hylland Eriksen and I'm a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo. And I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to the online version of the course Overheating and Anthropology of Accelerated Change. Before I start talking about overheating and accelerated change and the role of anthropology in understanding these things, let me just say a little bit about the course. This is a course which is given in a physical form at the University of Oslo. But those of you who are watching this are probably for one reason or another not able to make it to the auditorium in Oslo, Norway, so you're watching this instead. We are producing a full set of 12 lectures online, but in a slightly condensed form. So instead of 2 times 45 minutes, you're getting 2 times 23 minutes. But I promise you that in the course of these condensed lectures, you will get the gist of our argument, the best and most important examples, and the most productive and important theoretical and methodological ideas from the course. However, if you want to learn more about the overheating course, you might want to take a look at the websites. There are 2 websites. One of them is for the course itself, and you'll find it here, www.svuino.no/SAI, and you will then you'll search for a course called sosant2525. That's the numerical code of the course, sosant2525. Well, you find a reading list, an introduction to overheating, various links, and maybe some other resources that you might find useful. And if you want to know more about the broader research project after which this course has grown, and which it is part of, go to the overheating website, www.uino.no/overheating, in one word. Because overheating is not merely a metaphor and not merely a way of talking about speed and change. Some of you may think about climate change, which is part of it, but it's not the whole story. But it's also a research project where a group of anthropologists are trying to understand some of the local implications of accelerated change in the contemporary world. And during the course of these lectures, you're going to meet many of these researchers who are working in various parts of the world trying to make sense of the way in which local people respond to global change and to fast changes. You're going to meet Elizabeth Schauber, who's a postdoctoral fellow who's working in the Philippines and has formerly worked in South Korea. You're going to meet Wim van Derle, who's an anthropologist of food, also a postdoctoral fellow who works in Sri Lanka. You're going to meet Katrine Moe-Thorleifsson, also a postdoc, who works on political responses to the economic crisis in Europe. And she's particularly focusing on various expressions of xenophobia in 3 different European countries. And you're going to meet Astrid Stensrud, also a postdoc, who's an anthropologist of water and the Andes, and who works in Peru, looking at implications of the melting glaciers and other subjects, other expressions of crisis. And finally, you're going to meet Robert Pijpers, who's a PhD fellow at our department and at the Overheating Project, who is an anthropologist of West Africa and of mining with his fieldwork in Sierra Leone. So there's a fairly broad range of issues which are going to be raised and a broad range of people whom you're going to meet. And all of the people you're going to meet are in the middle of some really fascinating research, and they're all passionate about what they're doing. So I recommend that you follow and that you watch us as we go along. Now, what I'm going to do today is to introduce the anthropology of accelerated change and the anthropology of overheating. And I'm coming back for some later lectures on other, you might say, more general, theoretical and methodological subjects. Now, the anthropology of accelerated change or of globalization. There is, as many of you would know, there's a huge literature on globalization out there. It's been one of the major growth industries in academic life for many years. I can remember when I was a PhD fellow myself in around 1990, the word globalization all of a sudden made its entrance into the social sciences. And it almost felt for some time as if it was impossible to go to a conference at all in the social sciences without the word globalization somewhere in the title. And sometimes coupled with concepts such as identity, perhaps, or culture, globalization, culture, and identity. And many of us were sort of shrugging a bit at this and thinking that this is a passing fad. Globalization is a term that suddenly became fashionable for a variety of reasons that I'm coming to in a little while, but it will go out of fashion, which it never did. We're still talking about globalization, and with good reasons, because the world is in many ways becoming a more integrated place. And this integration of the world is taking place at an accelerated speed. And this speed at which the world is becoming more interconnected, and where there is more change, and where change is happening faster, it's almost as if it's shifted to a higher gear since around 1990. In only the last 25 years, we've seen an enormous acceleration of a number of interrelated processes of change. And this is what we are doing in overheating. The overheating project, as you will find out if you go to our website, has two subtitles. It's very typical in anthropology. We have a short title, usually a metaphor, and then you have a long subtitle. And we've got two subtitles. One of them is the three crises of globalization. What are the three crises of globalization? Let me say it very briefly, the way we perceive the major crisis of globalization. Crises which, in a sense, exist at the global scale, but which have local expressions which vary between localities, and where those localities are connected to each other and to higher scales in different ways. So they have to be studied locally. As Clifford Geertz, the famous anthropologist who died a few years ago, once said, if you want to study humanity, you can only do it by studying humans. And what humans are is, beside a lot of other things, that they are different from each other. In other words, there is a uniqueness to each place which we need to capture if we want to understand what the global is about. The global is always, in a sense, local. But these three crises of globalization that we're looking at, what are they? Well, first one, make a guess, no. The first one is environment and climate. It's not going away. It's a major issue. The environmental degradation around the world as a result of frenzied human activity and the long-term implications for climate on the planet, which has some very serious implications indeed. Secondly, economy and finance. Recurrent financial crisis and economic uncertainties at a large level, large level of scale, okay, high level of scale. We see this in financial markets, in stock exchanges, in the sort of very unpredictable prices of various materials, products, etc. But you also see it at the local scale, as in the growth of the group of people who are now increasingly known as the precariat. A word that also came into fashion, but much more recently than globalization. The precariat, people who are in a precarious situation in the labor, in the work situation. So that's the second crisis, and the third one is the one which we call the crisis of culture and identity, which is to do with the right to define who you are. Things are changing fast around me. Things are changing in my world, in the modern, contemporary world characterized by superhuman speed in some ways. What are the implications for who I am? And how can I be the person I want to be under these new circumstances? The crisis of culture and identity. So these are the three crises. But we also have another subtitle for the project. So, Overheating, the three crises of globalization, or an anthropological history of the early 21st century. And to me, at least, the early 21st century is a period beginning, let's say, January 1991. Okay, if you really need a date, let's say 1991. I'm coming to that in a little while. Why 1991? Why is this a new world? And what's special about it? And what does anthropology have to say about it? But first of all, since many of you who are watching this probably don't have a background in anthropology, what is it that anthropology has to bring to the table when we talk about globalization? After all, anthropology has historically been about small places. I mean, I wrote a textbook myself called Small Places, Large Issues, where the idea is that by studying in intricate, in intimate, minute detail a small village or a small community somewhere, that will tell you something very fundamental about the human condition and what it means to be human, and about the nature of society, and about a number of other important questions that we ask in the social sciences. So anthropology has historically mainly been about small places, not exclusively. There have always been macro-anthropologists who have been interested in the large-scale connections in the world, but that's mainly been the niche of anthropology. Whereas globalization is about very big things. Globalization, isn't that, you know, about the World Trade Organization, about Microsoft, about global neoliberalism, and about global climate change, which are huge, large-scale processes. So how can anthropology have anything to say about this? Well, I think I've already indirectly justified an anthropology of globalization, but I think I'll put it in a slightly different way. For many years, like many of you, I've enjoyed reading popular books about globalization, and they were called things such as Jihad versus Macworld, or The World is Flat. You know, they had this kind of titillating titles, books that you could pick up at an airport. Some of them were international bestsellers. Some of them were read by political leaders, and they were very entertaining. All of these books, I learned something from all of them. General books written by people who want to tell us something important about the contemporary world. But at the end, maybe that's because I'm an anthropologist, I don't know, but at the end, after finishing one of these very popular, very entertaining books, some of them more scholarly than others, some of them more academic, written maybe by sociologists or political theorists. At the end of the reading, I frequently had the feeling that it was as if I'd been invited to a fancy 3-course dinner, and they'd given you a great starter and a lovely dessert, but they somehow forgot to give you the main course. And what is the main course in this sense? I should say the main course, when we look at the menu of globalization, it's people's lives. It's the way people experience their world, talk about their world, often in very local terms, and how they respond to these large-scale changes that take place all around them. And that tends to be missing out the complexities, the intricacies, the contradictions, the inner conflicts within which people live. So we want to reach that level, because even large-scale society, even global society, at the end of the day, it takes place between people. So we have to get there. We have to get close to people. Another way of putting it is like this. I'll put it in 2 other ways. Just say something about the anthropological gaze. And there are many other things that could be said about the anthropological gaze, but these are some of my sort of favorite ways of looking at what is peculiar to anthropology. We might say that there are 2 kinds of social scientists. I guess there are many kinds of social scientists, but let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that there are 2 main kinds of social scientists. Or rather, 2 main kinds of social scientists who are interested in globalization, who are interested in the way in which the world is being increasingly integrated and connected, and conflictual, and full of frictions and contradictions, but connected. You have those who circle the world in a helicopter with a pair of binoculars, you know, looking down, and gives you a really good overview. And sometimes you take your binoculars away and you just look at the landscape below you, and you take notes, and you compute, and you make calculations. And on a good day, if you're lucky, you'll end up with a 4-field diagram. That's one way of studying globalization. The other way is by crawling around on the beach on all fours and examine each grain of sand. Or rather, maybe not each grain of sand, but you examine the relationships between those grains of sand, and their mobility, and their processes, and the space between them. And after having done that, you end up with a credible analysis of the human condition in a globalized world. Now, before I continue, and this may be a footnote, I think we have to do both. Yes, we should crawl around on all fours. We should get the gist of people's life world. We should really get sort of beneath their skin to the extent that it's possible, to really understand what life is like in this particular community. But we should also retain the gaze from the helicopter, which gives us the overview, and we should connect those levels and the intermediate levels. Right. The second way in which we can think about how to do, or rather what anthropology is about, compared to other social sciences, is, there's a story about the historian, the sociologist, and the anthropologist who set out to study the Niagara Falls. Okay? The sociologist goes first, and he carries with him, a lot of stuff. I mean, measuring apparatus, so he measures, the amount of water that runs through the Niagara Falls every minute. He sort of takes samples of the water to find out, the amount of minerals and, the mixture of various substances and so on. He measures the height, the width, etc., and the speed by which the water flows through the river. And basically, he ends up with a lot of good, useful, quantitative data. It's hard work, but he does it. Next, the historian. Now, the historian has a problem, because a historian can usually only study things which have already happened. So the historian has to wait until the river has dried out, and he can then walk around in the dry riverbed and make his observation and take his notes. And at the end, he will come up with a wonderful story about the way in which this waterfall and river have looked when there was still water running there. Now comes the anthropologist. What does the anthropologist do? Well, the anthropologist walks over to the waterfall, he fills a cup with water, he walks back, goes into his office, sits there for maybe about 2 years. Okay? Anthropology can sometimes be slow science. Sits there for about 2 years and looks at this and takes notes and thinks, and at the end, after having analyzed this cup of water for 2 years, he can write a monograph about the Niagara Falls, which includes knowledge about everything from the amount of minerals to the width to the height, the speed through which the water flows, and maybe even some speculations about what it's going to look like when the river has dried out. So this is part of an anthropological self-understanding, and while it has a lot to recommend itself, I think we should be wary of it. Anthropologists need help from others in order to make sense of the contemporary world. Yes, we need to crawl around on all fours with our magnifying glass. And yes, we need to take this little sample of water and study it meticulously and then come up with a monograph. But we also need help from the guy in the helicopter and the guy with all the measuring equipment and the lady who walks around on the, in the bottom of the dried out riverbed. We need to think in an interdisciplinary way about the contemporary world in order to make sense of it. So although overheating is a course in anthropology, I very much want it to be interdisciplinary and to learn from and to speak to people who are not anthropologists. Now, having said this, what exactly is it that we want to talk about in the course about overheating? When we say accelerated change, it could be a lot of things. What does it mean that change accelerates? Let me put it this way. Modernity has been committed to the idea of change since the beginning. Change is part of the lifeblood of modernity. The modern person has change in his or her bones. We accept change. And not only do we accept change, but we celebrate change. Change is good. I mean, there was a bloke over in America who went, I think that was one of his main slogans when he ran for president some years ago. Okay? And people voted for him. They wanted change. Isn't this normal? Doesn't everybody want change? The answer is no. In many societies that have been studied, not least by anthropologists, change has been seen as a threat. It's a threat to your tradition. It's a threat to your livelihood. It's a threat to who you are. It's disruptive. So change is something that needs to be resisted. Whereas modernity sees change as being essentially positive. Of course, not all kinds of change, but a certain kind of change. And those are mainly the kinds of change that we have called progress and development, right? Progress and development are good, and they entail and they are somehow committed to and wedded to the idea of change. So the idea of change is not new. Change is not new. Fast change is not new. People, I don't know if you're aware of this, but people at the outset of the Industrial Revolution in England were worried about the speed of change and about the speed of everything. They thought that things were happening too fast and things were happening in the wrong way, and they lost control. And they asked themselves a question that we in the overheating team have asked many people around the world in the last few years. Namely, what do you think about what's happening here? And they might ask questions of the generic kind: who can I blame and what can I do? Who can I blame and what can I do? And this is a kind of question which was asked quite often at the outset of the Industrial Revolution. Who can I blame and what can I do? Maybe you could blame the capitalists for changing your environment, for disrupting your way of life, for herding people into the new towns and into coal mines, etc., where they were exploited ruthlessly. Or you could find someone else to blame. But there was an anxiety about change and speed as early as the early 19th century. When the first trains came, in the early decades of the 19th century, roughly, there were major concerns in England about the speed with which these trains transported people, right? Because it was argued that the speed was mentally unhealthy. It made people mad, okay? It made people slightly mad because the trains moved so fast. It was unnatural. Now the average speed of a train in the early days of the steam engine would not have been more than maybe 30 kilometers an hour. Not particularly fast for you and me, but fast for the people whose benchmark was the horse carriage, right? Which was much slower. So there was a concern with speed already then. And there were visions about globalization at that time as well. Or if we just zoom ahead a little bit from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, take the mid-19th century, the first transatlantic telegraph cable that was opened in the late 1860s. You could now, for the first time in history, you could send a telegram from London to New York. And it only took a short while to arrive. Whereas in the past, it would have taken weeks and months for news from Europe to reach the United States. At the time when the first transatlantic telegraph cable was opened, and they got it to work. And they managed to send telegrams back and forth. The London Times published an editorial where they said something to the effect that this is the greatest achievement of humanity since the building of the pyramids. I'm not arguing for or against this statement, but I would like to say that the author of this editorial had clearly seen something. He had seen an incipient world of instantaneous global communication, and that was something qualitatively new. So yes, change has taken place, and fast change has taken place, and acceleration in mobility, in transport, in communication. Yes, it took place in the 19th century, but it has accelerated now. And in the second part of this lecture, I'm going to show you some of the ways in which this change has accelerated. And I'm also going to begin to suggest some of the ways in which we can study those changes anthropologically.